And now, ladies and gentlemen, my laundry room.
Alright, well, in case the thumbnail didn't give it away, I'm going to be making a cabinet and some floating shelves. The cabinet is going to be a nice big deep one, and the floating shelves are going to be floating. I'm going to be making the cabinet first, so I'm going to cut some plywood down to the dimensions I want for my cabinet. Oops! Maybe make sure your cord is out of the way before you make a long cut like this. Hopefully my utility knife can solve this problem for me. Let's try that again. Now I'm going to cut some dados for the top, bottom, and back of my cabinet. Dado, he said dado. There's my life savings again. They tell me it's actually less valuable than it was in the last video. How does that work? This dado sled has proven to be incredibly handy. If you want to make your own, check out the video linked above. Alright, now that I have all of the pieces and dados cut, I'm going to be drilling some holes so that I can put in some adjustable shelves. I'm going to be using this Miles Craft cabinet mate. It's actually really easy to use. The only thing is you need to make sure that you assemble your cabinet in the proper order. I'm not speaking from experience on this, of course, but I know some of you might make that mistake. Now we are ready to assemble our cabinet. I think in the last video I had a hard time deciding which clamps to use, and that dilemma continues. Does anybody see what I'm doing wrong here? Don't worry, I'll notice eventually. Alright, if you are making your cabinets the same way I'm making mine, you're going to want to make sure you put the back in place before you assemble the other four sides.
Hit myself in the forehead.
If you miss that step, you're also going to want to make sure you don't hit yourself in the face while disassembling your cabinet to fix your error. You are also going to want to make sure that the dados you cut are the same size as the pieces you need to fit in them. Apparently, 1/4 of an inch at Menards is not the same as 1/4 of an inch at Home Depot. Alright, I think I have resolved all of the issues that I have had thus far with this cabinet, so we can get back on track now and finish the assembly. Thank goodness.
It's time to put in the shelf clips.
I had to use up the last of my elbow grease, but I did eventually get these shelves in.
You can have some of my elbow grease.
Now that the cabinet sarcophagus has been assembled, it is time to put some facing on the shelves. Some of you might also know it as a carcass, but it will always be a sarcophagus to me. All in all, I'm pretty happy with this project, but I have to say I'm never satisfied with how painted wood looks, at least not when I paint it. I may be looking to hire a professional in the future.
That paint is bad.
My color commentator was so upset with my paint job that she decided to leave. Why is it so hard to find a non-judgmental color commentator? Alright, that's enough of that. I don't really like painting anyway, so let's get this thing on the wall. Because I only used 1/4 inch plywood for the back, I did put in some cross bracing, although you may have missed that because it was a very short clip. Alright, now we are ready for the shelves. Good thing I got myself a new can of elbow grease. Things are looking okay. Let's try making some face frames and some doors. For face frames, we're going to use the Craig jig. She's a great gal. I wanted to make this cabinet match the ones I have in my kitchen, even if they aren't the same color. So I'm trying to make a shaker style kitchen cabinet door. Like most things I build, I've never done this before, so it's going to be a challenge, but I think I'm up for it. After ripping the outside frame pieces of my doors to their proper width, I was ready to start cutting the dados. I had a little bit of wood left over from the mudroom project, so I'm going to use all that up that I can since it's all going to get painted the same color anyway. It is very helpful if you can cut these dados dead center on your board, but it's not a deal breaker. It just makes life a lot easier when you're cutting the opposite section for assembly purposes. That said, my dados were not dead center. Alright, let's see how we did. Since I am not immune to mistakes, I'm going to dry fit everything first to make sure I don't have to redo any of the pieces, and once I have that figured out, I can start to cut my center pieces. Whoops, I got that one on backwards. The center pieces are pretty straightforward. I'm just going slightly smaller than the dados that I cut on my frame. That way, once everything's assembled, it'll look nice and clean. Moment of truth here. Will it fit? Oh yeah, slid right in. Now that we got that all situated, we can begin the final assembly of the cabinet doors. I decided, somewhat foolishly I fear, to assemble 3 of the 4 pieces of my cabinet frames, and then paint the entire cabinet door, pre-assembly, before I did my final assembly. I know that's not really the normal way of doing things. I just thought, given some of my painting issues, that it might help reduce the frustration that I was having with the paint. I also thought that if I painted everything after assembling it, I would get paint built up in the edges of the cabinet doors, and it would be a pain to get out and it would look weird. I guess we'll never know if that would have happened or not, but in hindsight, I wish I had just used my sprayer and sanded it a little bit in between coats. I think it would have gone a lot faster, and I think it would have at least looked as good, if not better, than the paint job I ended up with. I ended up doing a lot of paint and then sand and paint and sand and paint and sand because I just wasn't happy with how the paint was looking. It did get better every time I put a new coat on, but I think it was a lost cause. Eventually, I reached a point of diminishing returns, so I decided to install the hardware and move on with my life. I had a few leftover hooks from my mudroom project, so I decided to repurpose them into cabinet pulls. That way, everything matches nice. Now it's time to move on to part 2, the floating shelves, but before we do that, I just want to remind everybody that if you're butting floating shelves up to a cabinet, it's wise not to install your face frame or your cabinet doors until the floating shelves have been installed. I would never make such a mistake, but I know some of my viewers don't have quite as much foresight as I do, so I just wanted to remind everybody. For the floating shelves, I'm just building some simple brackets out of some 2x4s that I ripped down to be approximately the same thickness as the inside of my floating shelves. That way these can be screwed into place on the wall as well as the cabinet, and the floating shelves should be nice and sturdy. Because I wanted the shelves to match the bench from my mudroom project, I'm going with some edge-glued pine or some similar form of wood, and then I'll be using the exact same staining and finishing process as well. I'm just going to cut these shelves to their approximate length, And then unfortunately the wall / cabinet angle is not quite 90 degrees, so I'm going to make the final cut with my guide and my skill saw so that they'll fit properly. Next, I'm going to cut a bevel on the shelves that is just slightly north of 45 degrees, or maybe it was just slightly south of 45 degrees. I don't quite remember. Just note that you want to cut your bevel so that they come together at the point or the outside of the bevel so that there is limited gapping, or hopefully no gapping at all. Now I'm just laying down some packing tape to put the pieces of my shelf on. It makes gluing up the boards a whole lot easier, and I'm speaking from experience on that one. I've learned that through a very short and frustrating woodworking career, if you can call it that. I also used a few pieces of scrap wood that were the same thickness as the inside of the shelf as spacers. That just makes keeping the proper form a whole lot easier. I also added some nails to the mix because I just don't really trust myself.
Nail it.
I see my color commentator has returned, and just in time to watch me burnish this shelf. The shelves actually came together very well, so I didn't have to do a lot of burnishing. This one was by far the worst, but for those of you unfamiliar with the process, put a little glue in any gaps in your glue up, and then rub it down with a burnishing tool such as an old screwdriver, and then sand it down with some rough 100-ish grit sandpaper, and that gap should disappear like it was never there. Alright, let's get these shelves in so we can be done with this project. I'm just screwing these homemade brackets into the studs of my wall or into the cabinet, and of course I am making sure that they are level as well. Now that those are all in place, it is time for the shelves. Let's see how they fit. It did take a few adjustments, but I did get them all in eventually. Fortunately, I had that extra can of elbow grease lying around. Now I'm going to install my face frame for the very first time. I certainly didn't do it once before. And then I'm going to fill in the nail holes and touch up a little bit of paint, and then I'm ready to install the doors, which again I have never done before and certainly didn't need to remove prior to installing the floating shelves. It's a good thing that these hinges were adjustable. That's all I'm going to say. With that, I want to thank you for watching another thrilling episode of The Weekend Woodworker. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. I'd hate for you to miss out. We'll see you next time, and remember, sweat for it, don't go into debt for it. My color commentator tells me I have a tea party to get to.